All right. Wow, it worked on the first try. Okay, thanks. That's a bucket list item. I've always wanted to have walk-up music like a baseball player has. And so bucket list item checked. So New Orleans has a rich tradition of amazing musicians. And so I chose some music from a local musician that I think of when I think of New Orleans. This guy. Anybody recognize him? Brian? Some OG New Orleans people probably know who this guy is. So this is Silk the Shocker. He's Master P's brother, if that means anything to you. If not, he's Little Romeo's uncle. And if you're younger than that, he is Romeo's uncle. All right. All right. We got all of our bases covered. Okay. So who am I? I am Todd Resudek, and I am a member of the Hex core team. And you can find me online at Super Simple or derivatives thereof. So please follow me on Twitter, and I'll follow you back so we can be friends. And full-time, like my day job is working in Elixir as a lead engineer at Weedmaps. And for those of you who don't know, it's not what it sounds like. It's an app that you use to find weed. I know. People they never know. But this talk is not about weed. It's about power couples. And since I'm active in the build tools system of the Erlang and Elixir communities, when I think of a power couple, it might be a little different than most people. So you might think of like Bill and Melinda, or Beyonce and Jay-Z, or Michelle and Barack. But when I think of a power couple, I think of Mix and Hex. So these are a couple of projects that literally every Elixir app uses, but I think most people never really learn about how they work or what they can do really. And so that's why I wanted to give this talk today, to sort of shed some light on what's going on behind the scenes when you use them. So let's start out with Mix. So Mix is, as you probably know, this is a build tool that ships with the Elixir, and provides tasks for creating, compiling, testing, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're installing Elixir on your machine, you're actually installing a couple of executables, and one of them is the Mix executable. All right, so this is how you normally interact with Mix. So this is like most people's familiarity with Mix is type Mix and then the name of a task, and then it does something. But how does that work? Some people will never know. It's like magnets. But it turns out there's actually some code and documentation, and so what I did was actually look at it and figured out, hey, how does Mix work? So this is an example Mix task that I put together just to kind of show the anatomy, the anatomy of a very basic Mix task. So this one is, I call it stir, and all it does is stirs up a binary. So you give it a binary argument, and it shuffles it, and then spits it back out. So you'll give it some characters, and it'll spit out the characters in a random order. So every Mix task is going to look like this at the top. So it has a module name, so mix.tasks.task name, and I'll kind of explain why it has to be named that way. Short doc. So the short doc is going to show up in Mix help. So if you type in Mix help inside your application, it's going to show you all the Mix commands that are available to you. And so in this case, you can see Mix stir is registered in there, and it shows my short doc. Stirs up a binary. And then a run function. So this is a callback. So run one, it takes a list, which is a binary, and that's really all there is to a Mix task. So you've got the name, you've got the short doc, and you've got this run one callback. So this is if you're running this command, you just type mix stir. And so I'm just going to make stir, and I'll give it some random characters. And whoa, that is so random. Okay. You don't know how relieved I am that that worked out. I was like telling Eric before this that like, if that bombs, I'm just gonna move right past it and like pretend like it never happened. Okay. Whew. Oh my gosh. Weight has been lifted. All right. Okay. Whew. Now that we got that out of the way. All right. Mix new app name. All right. If you're lucky, you get to do this fairly often. So you start a new mix project and you see this. You see a whole bunch of stuff that says, hey, I'm creating this and this library, and I'm putting this file, this and there. Where did all that come from? Well, it turns out this comes from this module. So there's a mix.tasks.new module that has this generate for function in it. And if you look at that function, you're going to see code like this. There's a few more things, but basically it says, okay, create a file, and then you give it a name and a template to sort of make that file. And you can also see like create directory, so it creates your lib directory and then starts creating files in there. All right, but where, create file, create directory, where do those come from? Those come from this module here, the mix generator module. And so it turns out this module is perfect for doing stuff like that. It's got these 8 functions in it. And you can see, copy file or create file, embed template, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in most systems that I've used in the past, like this is usually make files. It's like I want to do this routine process, and so I'll generate a make file that creates this template structure for you. But it turns out, just like most things in Elixir, it writes itself. It's written in Elixir to make new Elixir projects. All right, and so we've talked about mix task, but there's also another way to call mix task, which is mix aliases. And so aliases, if you're not familiar, are just shortcuts or tasks that are specific to the current project. And so I actually knew about the shortcuts thing before, but this tasks specific to the current project was something that I just learned. So if you look at these aliases, you can see like C as compile. So there's a shortcut, like since you're typing mix compile a lot, why don't I just make an alias called C, and then I only have to type mix C. But the second one, this hello, that doesn't look like a mix task at all. So what that does is it says, okay, run this hello1 function instead. And the purpose of this is if you're creating a library that you need mix tasks in, you probably do not want to register those in the app that's pulling in your library. So you publish a library, you have a bunch of mix tasks that you use just for that library. Everybody that pulls in your library that types in mix help, maybe you don't want them to see all of your internal tasks that you use. And so this way of scoping a task, I think is really useful for that. And then also you can make these lists. So all can do a series of mixed tasks, any combination of those shortcuts or just regular mixed tasks. So I thought that was pretty cool. You can also like customize mix, so it responds to a few different environment variables to change its behavior. So a couple of these you're probably familiar with, like mix env or mix target. Target probably more so if you've been doing nerve stuff or other embedded stuff. But if there is some other limitation in your system that requires you to put your like mix exs file somewhere else, for instance, just be aware that there are some environment variables that you can use to set those up. All right, next, the option parser. So technically, this is part of the Elixir standard library. This isn't actually in the Elixir mix project, but its usage is basically just for mix. And a lot like what it sounds like, its main function is this parse function, and what it's designed to do is take arguments in from the command line, so as a list of binaries, and sort of encode them and encode them in a way that you can use them as a keyword list. So this strict keyword, for instance, is kind of a way of telling it what type it's going to be using. So like --debug is a Boolean, so it's not going to expect an argument after that. You could also tell it that debug is a binary, and then it's going to look at the next string that it's been given and parse that out as in the keyword list as key and then value, list, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, if you're going to build a command line tool, you need an easy way to parse all the command line options that you get. All right. Okay, so you're calling a list or a task or a list of tasks. What actually happens? You end up in this function that's in the mix CLI module. So you can kind of see a few steps here: load.config, load mix, exs, et cetera, et cetera. So let's kind of walk through these and find out what each one of them does. So load the .config. This, first and foremost, looks at your config file, loads all that in for that particular application. That's important. Next, it's going to load your mix exs file. And so it looks at that environment variable if you set that, and if not, it defaults to its regular place, which is just mix.exs, and make sure that that's a regular file, and it compiles it. So now you've, the first step of running a mix task, get my current configs for the current application that it's running in. And so next, these 3 and 4 are pretty self-explanatory, I think. So it gets the task. So what task did you just ask me to run? And then the next one, ensure hex. So if you've ever tried to run a mix task and then you get that warning that says, hey, run mix local.hex first, this is why. This function right here is making sure that you have hex installed. And next is this maybe change env and target. So if you have given it a separate environment to run in or a separate target to hit, that's what this is doing. So it's going to say, oh, okay, I'm running in this different environment. So instead of loading up the prod config, I want to load up the test config, or I want to load up the dev config, et cetera, et cetera. So it does that and reloads the project to enable the new configs. And finally, we end up in this run task. So it makes sure that your task name doesn't contain slashes. So just keep that in mind when you're creating a task. You can't put slashes in the name. I don't know why you would, but you can't. It runs this load config. So again, it runs the config for that particular application. So if your mix task is calling into a different application, it makes sure that config is loaded. And finally, mix task run. So it does a lot of stuff before it actually runs the task. And this is it. This is where we end up. So def run. And yeah, it looks and basically looks for the task. If it can't find the task, it looks and sees if it's an alias of another task. And then it runs the task and runs the tasks server. So I think the most important thing to learn about here is that there's a tasks server. And what this is it's actually an agent that keeps track of all the tasks that you have run. And so I think the common use case for this, why you need to know that, is if you're running 5 tasks, let's say, and each one of those has a step in it of mix compile, you don't want to run mix compile 5 times. So every time you run a task, it stores it in the agent, and that way if it gets to the second task and it says run mix compile again, the task server says, oh, I've already done that, just skip it basically. And that is mix in a nutshell. Now let's talk about the other half of this power couple, hex. So first I want to talk about some features that are built in, and then next I want to talk about some things that we're working on for the near future. So Hex is the package manager for the Elixir ecosystem, and it consists of the CLI, the website, the API, and a few other bits and bobs. So this is, I think, what most people are used to when they're dealing with Hex is mix deps get. And this is where mix meets Hex. So I like to think of mix as Carl Weathers, and Hex is Arnold in this case, and they're always really happy to see each other. And incidentally, I found there's a really, really crazy amount of Carl Weathers GIFs when you look for teams on the internet. Like, for some reason, Carl Weathers is the person that shows up the most. So yeah, I don't know exactly. I don't know why, but Carl Weathers is apparently a really good friend. And as far as I know, he knows how to make a heck of a stew. Okay, last time I told that, literally one person knew what I was talking about. Okay, it's Arrested Development. Okay. Okay. So ran mixdeps get. What does that do? It looks in your mix file, says, where are my dependencies? So this first form, I think, is the one that we're all familiar with, loading it in from Hex PM. But you can also load it in from a Git resource, or you can load it in from a local path. And so if you're developing a mix library, or if you have something that's really proprietary that your company doesn't want to publish out to mix or even to Git, or GitHub rather, you may want to load that dependency in as a path. So I just wanted to point that out so you know that that is an available feature. All right, so when you run mixdeps get, what does it actually do? So this hits the Hex resolver, and the Hex resolver is going to look at all of your dependencies and then find solutions, ways to resolve those. And it tries to pick the best solution once all the solutions are made. So if you have a dependency list of 10 dependencies, it's going to look for solutions for each individual one, and then it's going to go through and find the best solution for all of them together. And so the way it does that is it looks, is this a top-level dependency? So is this one that you've directly declared? And if so, it tries to use that. Is this from one of the children of those dependencies? And if so, it tries to use that. And if all else fails, it tries to find the solution that has the fewest dependencies. So if you're really interested, this is a 500-line file that contains one function that it's really, really, really crazy. But this is really how it resolves itself. There are different package managers work differently. So like NPM wouldn't have the same resolution issues. Like theoretically in Hex, it's possible to get two dependencies that conflict with each other, that it could never resolve because they're both requiring a child dependency that conflicts. Whereas like NPM, for instance, would effectively namespace those, so you'd have two versions of that child dependency. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Hex Docs. So another part of the Hex system is docs. And like one of the things that makes Elixir so great is that our docs are a first-class citizen. And it's a really great selling point for getting started. So most people probably access this directly through your browser. You just go to Hex PM, you search for something, and you can read the documentations that way. I know I'm mixing a lot of metaphors here, but so what happens when you get dependencies? So if another way to get dependencies, rather than go directly to the website, is right from your command line. So if you're an Emacs person or Vim person and you hate to use the mouse for some reason, you can just use the command line. No judgment on that. And mix hex docs fetch, and it's going to get all of your dependencies for you. So, so what does this do? So if you have an application with 5 dependencies, or in this case, it's got 3 dependencies, and you type this in the context of an application, it's going to look at those dependencies, figure out what versions you're using from your lock file, and then go out to Hex PM and download the documentation for that. So now you have a copy of it on your local file system. And this is stored in your Hex home folder. So it's home.hex /docs/repo name. So Hex PM is the public repo. So if you look in your computer there, you may have a bunch of downloaded documentation. And then if you add a package name to it, it's going to just download the documentation for that package. And so a couple of different rules, I guess, or some logic that's involved with that is if you request any of these, so EEX, Elixir, XUnit, logger, mix, it's going to look at your locally installed version. So if you are running on Elixir 1.8.3 and you type in mix hex docs Elixir, it's going to know that you want to get the documentation for 1.8.3, not the latest version. If you're inside the context of your app, it's going to grab the version that's in your lock file, like I said. And if it doesn't have any other context, so if you're outside of a mix app and you give it a package name, it's just going to download the latest version unless you specify a version number. And so if you wanted to open up hex docs from a command line, you could just do mix hex docs online and then the package, and that will go out, find the URL, and then open it up in your browser for you. So that's a neat little shortcut. But if you want to be really, really smart and have a big brain, you can do this one. So mix hex docs offline package. And so what this does is it's going to look in your local hex home folder, see if you've already downloaded that version. If not, it's going to go out to the API and download it for you, put it in your local file system, and then it's going to open it in a browser from your local files. So it's probably hard to see here, but this is actually on my, you can see the browser location is in my local file system instead. And so why would you do this, Todd? Great question, Todd. So let's say you have a commute, you're on a train, you're on a plane, somewhere else where there's really bad internet. Let's say you're going to the beach one day with your family and you really want to read about Mojito. Why is that so funny? This is a real indictment on my last vacation. Okay, but yeah, like if you want to have documentation for offline reading, this is a great little tool for that. So if you just started a new job and you want to get all the documentation for all the libraries you're using in your new app, you want to figure all that stuff out, you could just type this mix hex docs offline, boom, download them all, and you have them accessible regardless of internet connectivities. All right, another metaphor here, Rosie the robot. Housekeeping, okay. So like I said, I work on the Hex core team, and so this might not be the most exciting stuff, but I would be really remiss if I didn't implore you to use these next two. So mixhex.audit. Round of applause, anybody run this in the last month? Okay, if you're watching this on video, what's the number? It's about 30,000 people here. If you're watching, yeah, wow. And I didn't hear any applause. So, all right, mix hex audit. All right, do this. And what this is going to do is look at all your dependencies in your dependency tree and see if any of those have been retired. And so retirement is a very important way for package maintainers, package owners, to let you know that there's something really wrong with that version. So if there's a security issue, if there's a major bug, if it doesn't compile, for instance, they're going to retire that version of the library. You probably want to know about that as soon as possible. So mix hex audit. And the second one is this one, mixhex.outdated. And so letting this run. So this is going to give you a list of all your top level dependencies. If you do --all, it'll look at all your dependencies in your dependency tree, tell you what version you're on, what the latest version that was published is, and if there's an update possible for you. So in this case, like Alphabetify, I'm on a minor and I have it pinned to stay to that minor, so it's telling me, no, you can't update this. Whereas Mojito, I have it pinned to a major, so it's saying, yes, you can. So the yes and no is not like there is no path for you to upgrade. It means that the rule that you specified in your mix EXS file says that like I don't want to be able to just willy-nilly update to major versions, or if it's a 0 release, maybe you'd say I don't want to update minor versions without like my intervention first. But mix hex audit, mix hex outdated. If you do these, you'll be an excellent steward for your application. And so this is where I kind of like changed to what we've been working on as a team, I would say for the most part, for most of 2019, and that's security. So a couple of things that we've worked on is enhancing the UI. So we realize a lot of security comes from just a lack of visibility to know when libraries were updated and who updated them. And so we're trying to like bubble those things up and make them visible in more areas. So it's easier to tell when maybe something weird has happened. So we added the checksum. We've added the publisher and the owner's names. And so there was an incident in a different programming language this year where I won't mention it, it's not JavaScript, I promise, where a package that was being used, somebody asked the maintainer if they could take it over. He said yeah, he or she said yes, and they handed it over, and that person that took it over immediately published a new version with some crypto mining stuff in it. And so the idea here is like, you see EctoSQL is owned by these two people, and I'm used to seeing Jose's name, and now all of a sudden I see Joe Schmo just published this recent version. That should be a red flag, like I should do a more extensive audit of what this new code is. And on top of that, we've added these audit logs. So anytime you do anything major to a package, we keep a log of that, and we publish that to the HexPM page, so you can kind of see what has happened to it recently. Another thing we worked on is this integration with Have I Been Pawned? So there is a service out there that kind of aggregates all of the data breaches that happen and keeps track of those. And so if you log into the HexPM website right now, and your password is one that has been identified as having been breached at some point in the past, you're going to see a warning like this. And it doesn't mean your HexPM account was breached. It just means that your password has been found in one of those breaches somewhere. So it's either a very uncommon password and it is your account, or you're using a very weak password. And so it just informs you that it's very easy to kind of brute force into your account, and so we want you to set a better password. And mix hex package diff. So I know when you're upgrading packages, you want to know what the difference is, and a lot of times we just look at the changelog, or we look at maybe the GitHub releases and see what that code is. But unfortunately, what is on GitHub doesn't necessarily reflect what's in the binary, what's in that hex package. So hex doesn't have any external dependency on GitHub at all. So if you wanted to publish something nefarious in a new version, you could easily publish the package and then publish different code and say it's that version on GitHub. And most people would never notice the difference. But mix hex package diff and then give it an argument list. So it's the version you're starting from and then the version you want to go to. And it will spit out this command line diff of everything that has changed in that code between those two versions. So if you're very security conscious and you don't trust changelogs, I would encourage you to learn this command, and so you can easily figure out what's different, like what code you're actually changing in your application. All right, now coming soon. So these are some things that we're actively working on now but are not in production yet. So one of them is this tool of doing web-based diffs. So I realize like some people are not comfortable with the CLI's output of diffs. It can be kind of hard to read, especially if there's a lot of content. And so Johanna Larson has been working on this feature, which we're going to pull into Hex proper as soon as it's ready. And so this will give you the same, basically the same feature as hex.packageDiff, but do it using a web UI instead. So possibly a little bit easier to parse. And finally, two-factor authentication. So I've been actively working on that for most of the year. So soon we are going to have a two-factor auth system to keep your account extra secure. And more importantly, hopefully keep the accounts of the people that are maintaining the dependencies you use in your app extra secure. All right. So I just want to say thanks to Weedmaps for sponsoring me to come out here. And thanks to all the organizers of the Big Elixir for inviting me. We did it. Yes. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Todd. He's gone now. Any questions for Todd?
Oh, sorry. Hi there. Did you have any questions?
Oh, hold on.
I'll take one. Oh, sorry.
What motivated you to take on the thankless job of being on the Hex team?
Oh, yeah. So why did I join the Hex team? So I am a very strange type of nerd that likes build tools. And so I thought about this myself because I also thought this is kind of weird. A lot of people I know want to make commits to the Elixir Lang and say, yeah, I committed to Elixir, which I say is actually very cool. So when little backstory, when I was a kid, I played Little League, and I always wanted to be the catcher. And when I played hockey and when I played soccer, I was the goalie. And so if that makes sense to any of you, most people say, anybody that wants to play those positions is usually kind of the weird person. It's kind of like if you want to be the punter on the football team, I really want to play football. Oh, great, you want to be a quarterback, Jimmy? No, I want to be the punter. And so I guess I've always had this, and maybe it's because I am not that naturally athletic. I've always wanted this role player sort of role, like the Dennis Rodman of programming. So not in the weird way. All right, Robert Ory. Does that make? Okay, I'll stick with Dennis Rodman.
Big shot, Bob.
So role player, I'd rather get the rebounds, I'd rather get the block shots, I'd rather get the assists and let other people score all the points. And so when the cross-dressing and whatnot, which is cool, but yeah, so I guess my personality is just a little different.
There we go.
Yes. Specifically, I want to ask regarding hexes. I notice you're doing a lot of security-related features. I'm a core member to the Ruby Gems team.
Oh, cool.
And we had a lot of difficulty convincing people to move to signed releases, largely because it was an extra step for them and they just didn't want to. Are you thinking about doing signed releases? If you have already, have people adopted it?
Yeah, so the Ruby package manager is a little bit different than Hex. Hex releases have always been signed. It's just sort of built into the system. I would say, as an aside to that, I recently met with Sean Griffin from the Crates team. So anybody does Rust, you might know Crates is their package registry. And we were kind of going back and forth because we're both really working on security features this year. And I think, first of all, thank you for your contributions to Ruby Gems. And I would say that the biggest benefit that Hex has, and I'll say Crates as well, is the fact that we have way far fewer users. And so we are able to learn from the security breaches that happen in Ruby or that happen in NPM simply because they're such a huge target compared to us. And so it's not that we haven't had huge data breach or not data breach. We haven't had huge security problems. I think mostly out of luck in the fact that we haven't had as huge of a profile. But when we see things that happen in other communities, that usually forces us to look at our system and say, could that happen to us? And then what steps do we need to take right away to mitigate that from happening? So we have the benefit of kind of after the fact InfoSec sort of implementations.
Any other questions?
I'll take personal questions or...
I do have a question.
Okay.
How long have you been using Fish?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, So shout out to my friend Zach Thomas for turning me on to that. I've only been using Fish for a few months now. So I was a Bash holdout. I've been using Bash since I started programming. And I've always, like years ago, everybody's Z shell this, Z shell that. And then finally, my friend Zach showed me Fish. And I was like, you know what? It's going to be uncomfortable for a little while, but I'm going to do it. And so for anybody that has not checked out Fish, I would encourage that you check it out. It's really cool. So the type ahead and everything, really helpful.
Yeah, I like it a lot. I also only started using it a couple of months ago, thanks to Jason. He showed me, and he finally got me to take the leap.
Yeah, so take away from this lesson, you watched a 40-minute talk on Mix and Hex. Your takeaway today, figure out who Robert Ory is, and then install Fish. Or vice versa. You can do either order. Doesn't matter.
I have a personal story about Robert Ory, and we will. You can meet me at the happy hour for that.
Let's talk about it at happy hour. Big shot, Rob. All right.